This is lecture 111, Feudalism to Capitalism. We're going to return to the subject that we covered in Volume 1 in some detail now, the origin of European fiefdom feudalism. Now, scientifically defined, feudalism as a stage is a halfway house between chattel and wage slavery. The general contradiction of the slave stage continues and will through all of the stages of the servitude epoch. On the other hand, the general crisis of feudalism is that of both preceding and succeeding stages. In other words, just to refresh your memory, the general contradiction is an era, is a factor that we apply when we're discussing about the theory, when we're talking about eras. So in the era of primitive communism, we have a general contradiction. Then, in the era of the servitude epoch, whether it be slavery, feudalism, or capitalism, we have another general contradiction. But within each of the stages of the period of primitive communism, and in each of the stages of the servitude epoch, each of those stages has a contradiction which we call the general crisis, and that is the crisis, that is the contradiction that drives the evolution of that particular stage. So, I'm going to continue here and try and explain this again, but if necessary, you can always go back to Volume 1. At any rate, that is, feudalism features both the general crisis of slavery and that of capitalism. For that reason, the mathematical expression for the stage of feudalism takes the form of a simple quadratic equation, which is the equation for slavery, where the surplus value column is driven by the general crisis between the cost of the state and the profit otherwise obtained, and the formula for the capitalist stage, where the surplus value column is subdivided by the next generation of machinery cost and the profits otherwise available. Now, when a calculus is applied to this quadratic equation, the magnitude of the first equation of slavery declines relative to the second equation, that is capitalism. And of course, the definition of the terms remains the same in both cases. In other words, as the top equation decreases in percentile of production, the bottom equation increases proportionally as a percentile of production. And you can see this in the text of Volume 1 or Volume 7 when you get it. Eventually, the cost of an increasingly disaffected state apparatus in the face of rising slave rebellion forces a change in the social order. Now, this happened autochthonously first in China in 221 BC. It happened autochthonously in Europe over 1,700 years later in AD 1500. It happened throughout the New World after AD 1492, when European feudalists interrupted autochthonous sociocultural evolution, where the highest level in any Americans had achieved was a stage of slavery. Then the Europeans imposed a form of feudalism. Okay, what is key to our understanding is that slavery required armed thuggery instantly available to keep slaves in a condition of submission and obedience. It necessitates a vicious cruelty as a regular and visible means of terrorizing the slave population into submission and obedience before they revolt. Now, sadism is now the law of the ideological land, so to speak, and it has been since the stage of advanced theocratic chiefdoms. Sadism will continue as the dominant ideological persuasion within the superstructure throughout the servitude epoch. Slavery produces continuous resistance, continuous slave revolts, and this resistance must continuously be suppressed. This means a large and ever-growing army. More and more of the army garrisoned to police duties, guarding the larger and larger slave pens of the ancient world. In its extreme form, for example, Roman Italy, the entire Italian peninsula was turned into what was essentially one gigantic slave pen, a pen ruled over by a group of extraordinarily rich families and their massive state apparatus, the legions. In time, the legionnaires merged with the local populations of France, Iberia, and the British Isles. By the time the cost of their upkeep became too high for their masters, and the imperial guard was given their pink slips, it was a simple matter for it to meld into the countryside, into which they had already married, having nothing in Italy to return to. The historic compromise is that feudalism is the result of an historic compromise. The ruling families agree to give a certain amount of freedom to the slave families and take from them only a given amount of produce and or labor power. The specifics vary from place to place, country to country, but the effect is always the same. Slaves have become serfs, and their running away and revolting is reduced. The rapacity of the ruling families knows no end, and eventually the crisis of slavery will reappear, and more troops will be needed. Walls will have to be built, and women's feet bound. Walls and foot binding keep farmers in submission and obedience, and prevent them from sneaking away in the night. Nevertheless, feudalism is always a great historic compromise, granting a minimum amount of freedom to those formerly held as chattel in exchange for labor peace. Now, a flashback to imperial feudalism. One ruling class in the Chinese kingdom of Qin decided to forge a new way forward. It featured the militarization of the population. Qin was reorganized into a system whereby legal responsibilities to pay what was due the ruling families were combined with a land redistribution and an adjustment in the system of payments, in kind and cash. Slaves were made into small, sharecropping farmers and indentured agricultural laborers, able to pay, in some cases, in cash rather than commodities or time. Slaves became serfs. This new feudal way of life had its own ideology that in China is called legalism. Then Qin attacked the other 6 kingdoms of nuclear China. In a lightning campaign of several years, Qin brought all of them under its heel by 221 BC. This ended the Warring States period that had lasted from 481 to 221 BC, and that had featured 6 major kingdoms and 4 smaller ones in never-ending internecine conflict. One of the smallest had been the Kingdom of Qin, but it was in Qin where full-scale military modernization had occurred. This included the replacement of bronze weapons with weaponry made of iron and the introduction of cavalry and mounted infantry. In Qin's enemy kingdoms, the masses of slaves and would-be truly free farmers backed Qin against their own rulers. We explored this in detail in Volume 3. For now, in Chinese kingdom after kingdom, this legalist ideological preparation allowed the change in the structure of class rule. Why? Because Qin's legalist ideology was obviously in the best interest of slaves who wished to become less unfree, and it was in the best interest of the in-between strata whose income was limited by the common denominator of what had to be paid to keep the slave alive and in submission. In summary, the modernized military strategy and tactics of Qin, combined with its legalist propaganda, brought the rest of slave China quickly under its heel. Slavery gave way to feudalism, Chinese style. Qin's success with feudalism with Chinese characteristics marks the beginning of the period of continuous empire that lasted until the 20th century, at least in form. From that time forward, the new social order of feudalism existed in imperial form in China until it gradually began to dissolve under the impact of the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1860. And then feudalism was replaced de facto by capitalism. And by the way, this is where the name China comes from. That is from Qin. Now let's go back to the origin of European fiefdom feudalism. In the Mediterranean, the ruling classes were not as far-seeing. They had no one to bring them feudalism in imperial form. The Roman Empire West collapsed under the persistent impact of massive slave revolts, barbarian assaults from Russia and East Europe notwithstanding. These had been handled for centuries by the Romans, but became serious threats only when the empire was weakened internally. Now, one, by internal slave revolts that had tied down the legions in defending and occupying different regions of said empire, and secondly, over several centuries, Roman soldiers found that their farms had been stolen and their families enslaved in Italy. They had nothing left back home for which to fight. They would stay where they had been stationed for many years. If they returned to Italy at all, it would have been just long enough to find and rescue their families and then take them to their new homes. A case in point about which we know a great deal is what happened to the Roman legions stationed in Britain. In AD 383, the Roman British garrison was told that they had just received their last salaried pay. Honorius, who claimed the emperorship, said they were on their own. In Britain, many soldiers said, "Fuck it, let's stay here, where we already have families, jobs, and shops in the local economy." Some went back to Italy to retrieve their families, later returning, and integrated with their fellows into the new reality. From this new reality emerged the Arthur legends. At any rate, the collapse of imperial slavery in the Roman Empire West. The Chinese Empire expelled tribes and chiefdoms from Mongolia and Siberia. The pressure forced the Mongols westward in wave after wave of fleeing horse-based societies. Each time the westward flow of Mongol forces and the refugee farming masses they drove in front of them struck the Roman eastern frontier, they forced the Roman legions back on their heels. Repeatedly, these waves of escaping pastoral and farming masses from Russia, the Ukraine, and Eastern Europe in the 4 centuries from roughly 0 AD to about AD 400 overran the eastern wall in Europe. The Mongols had learned their lesson and created their own mobile armed force that conquered the lands into which the masses of tribal agriculturalists had fled. Then, the now formidable Mongol military overran the slave-based kingdoms of Central Asia, and for centuries the legion commanders compromised with the enemy at the gates. For money, they could be convinced to regulate the entry of the interlopers into parts of France and Iberia. The Roman defenses finally collapsed due to the internal class contradictions within the Roman Empire West. As we have seen, the Roman soldiers, no longer having anything to fight for in Italy, often left the oligarchs in Rome without the... Start that again. As we have seen, the Roman soldiers, no longer having anything to fight for in Italy, often left the oligarchs in Rome without their state apparatus. By AD 406, the largely foreign-based Roman army units began defecting wholesale, leaving rather quickly from the control of Rome Central. Each legion began to make its own way. Those having been garrisoned abroad for generations were now inbred with the local populations. This was the real reason for the collapse of the Roman Empire West, and the real way it happened. Slaves had built the empire, and now in revolt were taking it apart. As we have seen, the biggest of Rome's oligarchs had moved to Byzantium, that they now renamed Constantinople, and they continued their rule of much of the Mediterranean world from there. From the standpoint of the Roman oligarchy of rulers, the new arrangement worked even better than the old one when they were in Italy. They made far more money at a far lower cost. The resulting West European patchwork of nearly innumerable fiefs was the political form that feudalism took in Europe after AD 406. At first, these fiefs were slave-based, but necessity soon forced their slavocrat rulers to grant more freedom-creating, serf-based polities. Europe for 12 centuries thereafter was a pitiful, rather pathetic appendage on the body of Eurasia. Pitiful, that is, when compared to the vast wealth and advanced science and technology developed in China, where capital was concentrated, centralized, and reproduced in amounts orders of magnitude greater than in Europe. The Eurocentric view of the world, still so common in North America and Europe, is a purely fanciful narrative. It is a product of wishful thinking. It is a purposefully narrow view of the global history of the last 2 centuries. The slightly earlier emergence of full-scale capitalism in Europe enabled the fairy tale of these bastions of civilization that they were the center of the universe, when in fact Europe had always been a rather pathetic assemblage on the Eurasian landmass. This narrative is a reflection of the deep underlying ignorance characterizing our people's understanding of history. In Gringolandia, this kind of ignorance is the most important product of the everything important was made in North America propaganda kind of history taught in the mass media and in schools. Today's mass media narrative mythology about the Middle East, North Africa, South America, and the South China Sea has deep roots in this narrative mythology of Eurocentrism. This false narrative underlies the U.S. exceptionalist derivative fantasy, and that America, meaning Gringolandia, can be made great again. In reality, the Gringos' only greatness was achieved by stealing from the poor at home and abroad, and that kind of stealing was no longer available to the trillionaire bosses. In fact, they're getting ready to check it all for their new Byzantium, wherever that may be, perhaps Singapore. Anyway, in the Mediterranean, in AD 1500, the ruling classes were not as far-seeing, and as I've said, they had no one to bring them feudalism in imperial form. So, in summary, first of all, internal slave revolts tied down the legions in defending and occupying different regions of the empire. And secondly, for centuries, Roman soldiers whose farms had been stolen and their families enslaved in Italy and had nothing left back home for which to fight would stay where they had been stationed for many years. If they returned to Italy at all, it was just long enough to get their families to rescue them and take them back. And as I have pointed out, at AD 383, when they got their pink slips, they just melted away into the countryside. They didn't have to die or anything else. They had always been there, that is for hundreds of years by that time, and had married, and it was a simple matter just to continue as a citizen. Now, more on the collapse of imperial slavery and Roman Empire west. The general crisis of feudalism always lies in the balancing act of the feudal lords that have to maintain between the disappearing general crisis of slavery and the ascending general crisis of capitalism. This was true in both east and west of the Old World. This can be expressed with our equation in quadratic form, as I diagrammed above and described as best I could at the beginning of this lecture. Now, slavery meets feudalism in the Americas. And as I've said, the slave stage empires of Mesoamerica and the Central Andes were simply overwhelmed by the attack of the feudalist Ronin. Ronin are unemployed knights from Iberia, and this Ronin were successful because of the clay feet of the slavocrats. When the masses are slaves or little better than slaves, it's hard to rally them around the master and mistress classes. And Cortes had found that intra-class war, such as was occurring when he arrived in Mesoamerica among the ruling classes, could be used to his advantage politically and militarily. The Pizarro brothers found the exact same thing at Cajamarca, Peru, and followed the book of Cortes to the letter. This factor, when combined with Spanish steel, gunpowder, and horses, brought down slavery overnight in the New World. Now, feudalism was doomed by primitive technology, not because of the historic compromise, but because its technological base was essentially the same as the slave stage ancient world. In a word, primitive. Machinery with independent power to which unskilled, untrained labor power could be put to work changed the entire nature of wealth acquisition. And now, let's flash forward to capitalism for a moment. A commodity produced by machinery to which labor power has been put, little or no skill required now, has within it both exchange value and utilitarian value. The capitalist is interested in the commodity's exchange value, for in that act of exchange he can realize or materialize the surplus value inherent in a system of production, where the workers are paid at one rate, which we call value, and the actual realized value of what they produced is considerably greater. This is true because within the commodity there's also paid labor power and unpaid labor power, as we're about to see. And it's for this reason that the feudal system was doomed. not because of its nature as an historic compromise, but because its technological base was essentially the same as the slave stage ancient world, or primitive. But with machinery, there was an entirely new nature of wealth acquisition. The category of form determines commodity destination. The form of the surplus value produced determines where commodities must go. In other words, if I'm a capitalist producing iron, I have to sell it to another capitalist somewhere in the world who can use it to make something, for example, steel, because people do not eat iron and only other industries are markets. In this sense, humanity is still in a rather primitive condition, where the raw characteristics of the articles created dictates what must happen thereafter. A useful way to picture this, as I pointed out in the first volume, is to think of the opposite of destination being determined by form, as, for example, one sees when we think of the Star Trek replicating machine. You ask the machine for a cup of coffee, and the cup filled with coffee materializes. Now, in this futuristic vision, the value and surplus value inherent in the system of production are liquid, transmutable. Form, then, means nothing. If we assume that this future society is a communist system where there is no money, no classes, and no war, such advanced technological conditions make sense. That is, a la Gene Roddenberry's presentation of the future. Under such hypothetical conditions in the future, value and surplus value are truly free and can be transmuted at will into whatever form. Now, that is not the situation now, nor has it ever been in the history of capitalism, or for that matter, in the history of the world. We are still stuck with the fact that whatever the form of a commodity produced may be, so its destination is predetermined. People do not eat iron. Only certain other industries can absorb it, and thus the surplus value within it. Now this brings us to the category of labor power. Technically speaking, the moment human labor was commoditized as labor power, we had the emergence of the germinal of capitalism. By commoditized as labor power in capitalism, we mean that a group of workers in a factory put out so much labor per unit time. That unit of time is measured by the factory clock. Some workers may be more efficient than others, but for purposes of the commodity of labor power, it is whatever the averaged homogenized output per hour may be. Let us say it again. Labor power as a category and as a commodity is the homogenized or averaged factory clock governed collective output of a group of factory workers. Prehistorically and in the ancient world before factory clocks and without machines of the typology, diagnostics, listed below, labor power may also have been proto-commoditized, as I have discussed above, in a few examples, but these represent only proto-commoditization. That brings us to the mathematics of social production. In a truly abstract sense, in our equations, we have stripped the entire matter of social production to its essential four elements. These are A, labor power, B, technology. In the case of capitalism, it is machinofacture. In our time, automated and cyberneticized machinofacture. C, value, and D, surplus value. Now you may think of labor power in equations as having two sub-elements, consisting of 1, the 3 dimensions of work with machinery collectively undertaken, to which we add 2, a 4th temporal dimension. Thus work may 1 be measured and made more or less efficient in the mechanical performance sense, and 2, the necessary time it takes said work socially to occur. For example, the way workers are organized within the factory and at the factory bench may likewise be treated as a separate sub-element. That brings us to socially necessary labor time. The collective labor power input of a group of factory workers constitutes socially necessary labor time in capitalist production. Pre-capitalist stages, socially necessary labor time is far less a precise quantitatively determinable category. Nevertheless, it is critically important to cross-cultural analysis. This is true because in the primitive world and in the ancient world, slavery and early feudalism, work also had a measured character. Socially necessary labor time input was understood, if not precisely quantified, by those concerned. As such, socially necessary labor time is a broader and more flexible category than labor power, with its rigorous method of factory bench homogenizing and factory clock measuring of labor input. Furthermore, the very inherent nature of the capitalist system of factory production makes paid and unpaid labor power the basis for extracting profit, as we are about to see. It is this very nature of capitalism that makes it a legalized system of theft. Now, the law of value. The scientific definition of value, in its general sense, is the amount of socially necessary labor time involved in the production of some given commodity. In capitalism, value is the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to reproduce the cost of labor power, V1, and to maintain the machinery, V2. Usually we consider surplus value to be over and above these value costs, although in some instances both value and surplus value are terms included in discussions of value. In either case and in any event, in our discussions we have always reduced the matter of social production to its four essential elements, which are labor power, technology, value, and surplus value, with the caveat that for cross-cultural comparative purposes, we change the content of each term in a controlled way as we progress sequentially from one socio-cultural evolutionary stage to another, and from one set of equations to the next. Shorthand in Marxist academic circles for the value aspect of this productive process as a core concept is the phrase, the law of value. Remember, the ideal conditions include the world as a marketplace. Secondly, outside regulation is absent. That is, free, unfettered competition is a given in the mathematics. And third, only the essential elements are included in the equation. 1. Labor power in its fourth dimension of time. 2. Machinery or technology. 3. Value, the third. And 4. Surplus value, the fourth. Notice that the surplus value, SV, is that additional amount of commodity produced per given unit of time, which the capitalist appropriates, and it corresponds to unpaid labor power, which is to say also that it corresponds to unpaid socially necessary labor time. It is from this surplus value column that both profit and investment capital, NGM, or next generation of machinery, must come. And it is this fact of commodity production in capitalist systems which allows the capitalist to appropriate profit honestly, that is to say, without the stigma of swindling it via sharp trading practices. Sometimes we say we have both paid and unpaid socially necessary labor time in each commodity, and that saying refers to the amount of value, V1, V2, and surplus value, SV, represented in each commodity. Therefore, in addition to utilitarian value and exchange value, V1 and V2, and surplus value, we also have paid and unpaid labor power involved in each and every commodity. In practical terms, this means each worker is working part of her shift for her employer and not for herself. If one thinks, oh well, the capitalists are putting forth their factory and its equipment and the raw materials, so they deserve something. Perhaps, but remember also, the capitalists are the most recent of a long line of sharks who got their hands on communal property, made it theirs by force, and now confront you with the means of production in their private hands. You say, okay, but in the real world, how much is he taking from me right now? Well, when you see how great that is compared to what you're being paid, then you will acquire the beginning of proletarian consciousness. Capitalists make millions, billions, and trillions, and you know what you make. This is what we mean when we say the capitalist is stealing from you just by putting you to work for what little he has been forced to pay you in his factory or in his Walmart retail outlet. Finally, the production of surplus value and its rate of production is one thing. The production of profit and its rate of production is a separate thing. Now, these two categories are frequently mixed up together. There are many ways in which the capitalist may expend surplus value, and profit is just one outcome. This is of critical importance to us because, as you're about to see, it is the absolute decline in the rate of profit, not in the rate of surplus value production, which is the at-bottom cause of the general crisis of capitalism. Which brings us to mercantile capitalism versus true capitalism. Now, the moment that long-distance trade afforded the opportunity to make a profit at both ends of a deal, since the socially necessary labor time involved in production is a complete unknown to the partners on both ends, we had mercantile capitalism. That is, the accumulation of money capital in the process of long-distance trade. However, in economic analysis of sociocultural stages, we must always begin with the nature of the productive system. Thus, for true capitalism to be said to exist in the sense of production, we must have machinofacture extant. Then the potential of human labor is made real because it is magnified exponentially by the use of machinery and by the use of the new category of labor power. At the end of each day, we can visualize each hour as having a part of what is produced as value and another portion as surplus value. More practically, at the end of each workday, we can say X hours have produced value and Y hours have produced surplus value. You now see profit can be squeezed directly from labor power as it shows up in the surplus value column. Remember our definitions. Value 1 is the wage paid to the worker for his labor. Again, in strictly economic terms, we are purchasing the socially necessary labor time applied to machinery in the production of a commodity for exchange. Value 2 is the cost of maintaining the machinery and the factory. Money capital is accumulated via production when the owner of the machinery and the factory, who is also the purchaser of the labor power, appropriates profit from the surplus value column directly. That is, he no longer has to swindle money via sharp trading practices from a seller at one end of some deal and a buyer at the other. Now, what exactly is machinofacture? The manufacture of commodities via the input of labor power applied to machinery is what we call machinofacture. It is the technological heart of true capitalism. There were originally 5 essential technological elements to machinofacture, these being 1, a cheap and plentiful supply of highly carbonized flowing pig iron, from which a somewhat decarburized wrought iron was obtained, from which steel can also be made. And this meant blast furnaces for both the pig iron and the decarburized wrought iron. China had blast furnace flowing pig and wrought iron 2,000 years or more before it was independently invented in Liège, Belgium, about AD 1500. Now 2, machine tools to cut and work iron, steel, and make machinery. Thirdly, iron and steel to make iron and steel machinery to produce other commodities such as pottery and textiles, and steam engines. These were the first sources of power to be put to machine tools and machinery independent from those of nature, wind, water, animal, and human power. And as a matter of interest, the Chinese invented the steam engine many centuries before a French priest brought a Chinese toy steam engine back to France. This toy inspired Dennis Papin to put the principles to work. And the Britisher Thomas Newcomen heard of Papin's experiment and proceeded to build the first steam engine in the West that was later perfected by Mr. James Watt. And finally, the factory installation of machinery to which human unskilled labor power could be put to work. In this way, we see that the pure category of abstracted, socially necessary labor time, which is to say of commoditized labor power, emerges and is henceforth the key to capitalist production. This category, labor power, was Karl Marx's original and unique contribution to classical political economy. Otherwise, Marx accepted the categories of economic analysis of Adam Smith, Ricardo, et al. The proto-steps leading toward this entirely new category in economic analysis or what we should look for in our studies of prehistory. You will recall that we found this category clearly emergent for the first time in advanced theocratic chiefdoms, ATCs, labeling it so and assigning it the definition of being the new common denominator for determining V1. In so doing, we were linking socioeconomic prehistory to history. In volumes 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, I have explained this emerging new common denominator we now call the category of labor power country by country, and we will continue to do so in the coming volume 7 when it appears later this year. That brings us to a conclusion of this lecture, and now we're going to move on to the next lecture, which is on the development of feudalism in Europe overall after the collapse of the Roman Empire. I'm not sure whether we'll get to that today or not. If not, it'll be tomorrow or the next day.